So let's crack this thing open from the top. Because the storyline certain corners of the internet have been trying to shove down the timeline all week is that Kendrick Lamar is somehow afraid. Afraid of the game. Afraid of a bar-for-bar exchange. Afraid of crossing paths with somebody in public. Sit with that framing for 1 second, and it falls apart under its own weight. Kendrick Lamar is not a rapper anymore, not in the way the word gets used on podcasts. Kendrick Lamar is a blockbuster institution. Kendrick Lamar books a stadium the way you and I book a dentist appointment. When Kendrick Lamar walks into a room, the room rearranges its furniture around him. Nobody gets close to Kendrick Lamar by accident. People get close because he opens the door. That is the entire operating system of a Kendrick Lamar career, and pretending otherwise is a small man's fantasy wearing a hot take as a costume. This is an artist who spent a whole calendar cycle dismantling the biggest rap star of the modern era, stood on a Super Bowl stage with 100 million eyes on him, and did not blink once. And somebody wants you to believe the game is the variable that keeps him off the block? Come on, fam. That insults the intelligence of anyone who has been awake for the last 3 years. And notice the contradiction the other side keeps tripping over, because it is doing more damage than any diss record could. The same voices selling you that Kendrick Lamar is scared are, in the very next breath, telling you the game would put hands on Kendrick Lamar if they ever crossed paths. Hear what that actually confesses out loud. It admits the only path to victory runs through a physical confrontation instead of a lyrical one, which is exactly the exit ramp a man reaches for when he already knows he cannot survive the actual exchange. That is not a threat. That is a surrender letter dressed up as a threat. And Kendrick Lamar clocked it. Kendrick Lamar clocks everything. This is a man who has walked through Grammy ballrooms with sworn enemies in his eye line and never once adjusted his route. Fear is not in the file. Architecture is. Kendrick Lamar has a family, a label, a film career, a stadium operation, and a security apparatus that plans in quarters, not afternoons. If Kendrick Lamar does not appear at a particular corner on a particular day, that is logistics, not trembling. And the fact that this even needs explaining tells you how desperate the counter-narrative has gotten. Because when your strongest argument is that a man who just headlined the biggest stage on earth is trembling over a parking lot, you have already lost the room. Now, before we go one step further into this, if you already know Kendrick Lamar runs the entire board and you want every receipt the second it prints, do me one solid. Tap that like button, hit subscribe, and turn this video up, because the algorithm only blesses the channels that move early, and we move early here. Now, back to Smack, because what Smack actually said deserves a slow read. Smack told the room Kendrick Lamar personally told him there would be no response. And then, in the same breath, Smack said Kendrick Lamar is in the studio. Read those two halves together, and you realize they are the same sentence written in Kendrick Lamar's native language. When Kendrick Lamar is in the studio, Kendrick Lamar is responding. He is simply refusing to respond on the game's terms, on the game's timeline, or inside the game's promo window. Kendrick Lamar does not do Twitter fingers. Kendrick Lamar does not do Instagram live meltdowns. Kendrick Lamar does one thing when he is ready. He releases a body of work that swallows an entire year of conversation whole, and that release is the reply. So be very careful what you wish for, because Smack did not announce that Kendrick Lamar went quiet. Smack announced that Kendrick Lamar is loading, and there is a canyon of difference between those two conditions. A quiet Kendrick Lamar is a peaceful Kendrick Lamar. A studio Kendrick Lamar is a Kendrick Lamar stacking ammunition with the safety off. And the second half of Smack's message, the part half the timeline conveniently skipped, was a straight-up warning label. The translation was simple: do not push the button. Because if Kendrick Lamar ever changes his mind, nobody on the other side gets to sprint to the timeline crying victim. You do not get to poke a lion for 3 straight months, and then file a complaint when the lion finally lifts its head. That warning was not aimed at the fans. That warning was aimed at one very specific address, and everybody in that room knew the zip code. Which brings us to the move that is not getting nearly enough coverage. The move that might end up being the single most important data point of the entire month. AZ CHIKE. Now, if you have not been tracking AZ CHIKE, understand that he is one of the sharpest young voices the coast has produced in years, and his name was locked into the documentary 3. Confirmed. In motion. Done deal. And then, without a press release, without a subliminal post, without so much as a story highlight, AZ CHIKE pulled his verse clean off the project and disappeared from the tracklist. Gone. And you already know nothing inside the West Coast ecosystem happens in isolation. AZ CHIKE lives inside the Kendrick Lamar orbit. AZ CHIKE moves in Kendrick Lamar lanes, shares Kendrick Lamar rooms, eats at Kendrick Lamar tables. When a PG Lang adjacent artist surgically removes himself from a game album in the middle of a game versus Kendrick news cycle, that is not scheduling trouble. That is a flare fired into the night sky, and every Coast insider watching that flare understood exactly what it meant. Loyalty in this culture is not spoken. Loyalty is logistical. Loyalty is measured in who you appear next to and whose credits you refuse to share, and CHIKE chose his side without opening his mouth once, and the entire Coast heard him at full volume. And this is where Wack 100 storms into the frame, because Wack 100 has been running non-stop commentary on this situation from day one, and every single one of his framings is engineered to bubble wrap the game. Wack 100 has been out here calling CHIKE by a schoolyard nickname, a low-blow alias designed to publicly shrink the kid. But understand the psychology of that move. The moment you have to invent a nickname to make somebody smaller, you are confessing you cannot make them smaller any other way. Wack 100 is a chess player. Wack 100 knows exactly what he is doing on that board. But even Wack 100's most loyal listeners have started quietly asking why every intervention he makes ends up shrinking his own side. Look at the pattern and try to unsee it. Every time Wack 100 opens his mouth to fortify a position, that position is weaker by the end of the broadcast. The product he is selling goes like this. Kendrick Lamar is scared, the game is unbothered, CHIKE is irrelevant, and the whole Coast is unified behind the game's version of the story. For claims. Now stack them against the actual moves on the actual board. Smack, the man closest to Kendrick Lamar's business interests, is publicly confirming studio time. CHIKE, a rising Coast voice, is publicly amputating his own feature. DJ Akademiks, the biggest gossip node in hip-hop media, is reportedly mapping a physical trip to Compton, which 18 months ago would have been an unthinkable headline. And the game himself is releasing bars that flat-out contradict each other when you play them back-to-back. On one record, there is no smoke. On another record, he is name-checking the GNX, referencing Kendrick Lamar's exact iconography, daring the internet to call it what it is. You cannot occupy both lanes. Pick one. So the real question was never whether Kendrick Lamar is scared. The real question is why anybody is still pushing that storyline when every verifiable data point on the table leans the other way. Because Kendrick Lamar has stood in front of enemies far bigger than the game and walked out untouched. Kendrick Lamar spent an entire calendar cycle converting the most commercially dominant rapper of the last 15 years into a cultural cautionary tale. If Drake could not shake him, if the full weight of the OVO machine could not shake him, if a global streaming avalanche could not shake him, then a documentary 3 rollout was never going to shake him either. And understand, that is not disrespect toward the game as a legacy artist. That is arithmetic. When the numbers are that lopsided, you do not need to hear a word from Kendrick Lamar to know how the story ends. Now, this is where the whole saga turns almost cinematic, because the game is a walking contradiction on this one, and the tape does not lie. The game is on record saying he ushered Kendrick Lamar into the industry. On record saying he put Kendrick Lamar on early projects. On record saying he took Kendrick Lamar on tour and showed him nothing but love. All of it archived. All of it replayable forever. And then, in the very same era, the game is sliding subliminals into his records and daring the timeline to say the word smoke out loud. You cannot be the mentor and the marksman in the same breath. You cannot be the man who opened the door and the man trying to burn down the hallway. Pick a lane, fam. Because the audience remembers every interview where the game called Kendrick Lamar the greatest of his generation, and those clips are going to be replayed on a loop the second the tone officially switches. And since context is everything, let me rewind the tape for a second, because some of you were not locked in when this timeline actually forked. Back in June of 2015, the game brought Drake straight into Compton to shoot the video for 100. That afternoon was the pivot point. That was the moment the plates under the Coast shifted. For the people who grew up inside that ecosystem, watching an OVO flag Drake standing in the heart of Compton beside the game was a declaration of alignment, and alignments like that do not get forgotten. Kendrick Lamar noticed it then, and by every indication available, Kendrick Lamar has never unnoticed it. Kendrick Lamar files things away. Kendrick Lamar keeps receipts. Kendrick Lamar built an entire historic campaign against Drake out of receipts nobody else remembered existed. That 100 footage is still sitting one search away, and every time the game tries to reframe the history, the archive is waiting to testify. Understand what that means. This is not Kendrick Lamar waking up angry one morning. This is Kendrick Lamar watching, cataloging, and choosing his window. Kendrick Lamar does not react. Kendrick Lamar assembles. There is a reason his releases land the way an architect unveils a finished building. Every beam placed. Every load calculated. Every crack in the opposition mapped in advance. And when Kendrick Lamar is ready, the reveal is total. By the time you hear the first 8 bars, the argument is already over. So if Kendrick Lamar is in that studio right now, and Smack just told the entire world that he is, you can start running the math on what those sessions are producing. Kendrick Lamar does not book studio time for cardio. Kendrick Lamar does not burn hours for nothing. Kendrick Lamar does not step into a booth to record throwaways. If Kendrick Lamar is locked in, Kendrick Lamar is constructing, and whatever he is constructing is going to arrive long before the doubters are emotionally prepared for it. That is how this man operates. No countdown, no trailer, no warning shot. He appears, the record lands, and the culture recalibrates around it in real time. Now take a breath, because we have arrived at the part of the story that changes the entire lens. DJ Akademiks. And yes, that name comes with its own baggage, its own polarization, its own decade of chaos, is reportedly planning a physical visit to Compton. Let that marinate for a second. DJ Akademiks. Compton. In person. The same DJ Akademiks who spent the better part of 2 years platforming every available angle against Kendrick Lamar during the Drake war is now, if the whispers are accurate, preparing to plant his feet in the very city Kendrick Lamar has spent a whole discography canonizing. If that trip actually happens, it becomes a story all by itself, because Compton is not a tourism stop for a media personality who made his loudest content antagonizing the coast. That trip carries weight. That trip carries symbolism. That trip would be dissected frame by every West Coast commentator holding a microphone, and then run the collision math. What happens if that visit overlaps with a Kendrick Lamar release window? What happens if Akademiks touches down in Compton the same week a Kendrick Lamar record detonates? What happens if the game is pushing the documentary 3 into a rollout window that collides head-on with a move Kendrick Lamar has been quietly assembling for months? You start to see the trajectories crossing. You start to understand why people who work inside this ecosystem are telling anyone who will listen, in their calmest voices, that something is coming, that the pressure is building, that the storm has not formed yet, but the barometer is falling fast. And here is the line that separates the sharp observers from the loud ones. The people insisting Kendrick Lamar is scared are the exact same people insisting nothing is happening. Both cannot be true. If nothing is happening, why is the entire coast holding its breath? If nothing is happening, why did CHIKE walk away from the biggest platform he had access to this year? If nothing is happening, why is Smack confirming studio time in a public room? If nothing is happening, why is Wack 100 on the airwaves every 48 hours trying to reshape the story? People do not fight that hard to redirect a narrative that is not already moving against them. When something is truly a non-event, the response is silence, not a full-court press. Now let's sit with the game's bars for a minute, because this is where the contradictions go from awkward to almost cinematic. The game has one record where he essentially states there is no smoke with Kendrick Lamar. Then he has another record referencing the GNX. And if you know anything about Kendrick Lamar's most recent chapter, you know the GNX is not just a car. The GNX is a symbol. The GNX is an album title. The GNX sits dead center in Kendrick Lamar's iconography. Invoking the GNX while claiming there is no smoke is like standing in somebody's living room with mud on your shoes and swearing you were never inside the house. You cannot invoke the symbol and then pretend the invocation was an accident. Not with this audience. Kendrick Lamar fans read album covers the way musicians read sheet music, and nobody is sliding a GNX reference past that fan base and having it graded as neutral. That was the moment the tone genuinely shifted. Up until those bars, there was a legitimate argument that the game was simply running promo, generating noise to sell an album, and that everybody would move on once the project landed. But the second those GNX references dropped, the second the signals started pointing directly into Kendrick Lamar's iconography, the coast started watching differently. The commentary splintered, and CHIKE, who was still attached to the project at that point, quietly began reconsidering his position, which is exactly how dominoes behave right before something much larger falls. Anytime features start moving before a tracklist finalizes, and anytime the manager of the aggressor is on 10 podcasts a week, the album behind all that noise is in genuine trouble. Because the Whisper Network is roaring right now, and when I say Whisper Network, I am not talking about anonymous accounts with cartoon avatars. I mean engineers, producers, radio veterans, A&R types, label runners, people who have walked in and out of these buildings for 20 years. And what that network is telling anyone who will listen is that Kendrick Lamar is not just working. Kendrick Lamar is working with intent. There is a project on the runway. The tracklist is being sculpted. Collaborators are being summoned the way collaborators only get summoned when Kendrick Lamar knows precisely what the record needs to say. And hear me clearly on this part. If that project ends up addressing the game, it will not sound like a response. Kendrick Lamar does not write response records. Kendrick Lamar writes chapters, and whatever chapter is being written right now, The game will live inside it as a footnote, not as the name on the marquee. Nothing in Kendrick Lamar's catalog is ever about one man. Everything is about a larger idea, and individuals get folded into that idea in ways they rarely survive. That is the grand miscalculation everyone makes when they try to bait Kendrick Lamar. They imagine becoming the centerpiece of his next record. They imagine forcing the name drop. They imagine a Kendrick Lamar verse as elevation. Wrong on all three counts. When Kendrick Lamar closes a door, he does not slam it. He installs a new lock, changes the address of the house, and keeps walking. Ask Drake. Ask the long list of artists Kendrick Lamar has methodically stepped around over the years. You do not come at Kendrick Lamar and keep his energy afterward. You lose the exchange, and you lose the last decade of your momentum inside the same 8 bars. Now, in the interest of being fair, because this channel deals in honest reads, the game is a real legacy figure. That part is not negotiable. The game has a real catalog. The game has a real pen. The game has genuine years in this culture, one of the most talked about debut runs of the 2000s, and he carried coastal energy through a decade when the coast was running quiet. All of that is documented. None of it is up for debate. But legacy is not leverage, and that is the fatal flaw in the framing. Legacy is what you already banked. Leverage is what you hold right now. And right now, in this exact hour, Kendrick Lamar holds every dial on the board, every microphone, every eyeball, every algorithm, every stadium contract, every festival headline, every streaming spike. When Kendrick Lamar breathes, the room rotates. That is not a diss toward the game. That is simply the hierarchy saying its own name out loud. And you know who else understands that hierarchy better than almost anyone alive? Dr. Dre. Do not forget for 1 second that Dr. Dre has been Kendrick Lamar's mentor, co-signer, and architect since the earliest chapters of this story. Dr. Dre has watched every single move on this board, and Dr. Dre has said absolutely nothing. And when Dr. Dre goes quiet, the intelligent play is to go quiet too, because Dr. Dre's silence is never indifference. Dr. Dre's silence is calibration. Dr. Dre knows exactly what he wants to see happen next, and history says what Dr. Dre wants, Dr. Dre eventually gets. The list of people who tried to move against a Dre-aligned artist is a graveyard of careers that used to matter. Now pull the camera all the way back, because it is worth asking where the scared storyline even came from, since it did not materialize out of thin air. Somebody planted that seed. Somebody watered it daily. Somebody needed the culture to buy it. And every time you see a narrative that convenient, ask the oldest question in the book. Who benefits? In this case, the only person who profits from a Kendrick Lamar is scared storyline is the game. The only camp that profits is Wack 100's camp. The only broadcast that profits is a broadcast trying to sell an album into a marketplace already saturated with Kendrick Lamar's aura. Draw the arrows between the sources, the timelines, and the beneficiaries, and the picture becomes almost embarrassingly obvious. And that brings me to the comment-worthy question I want sitting in your feed tonight. Does Kendrick Lamar owe anybody a response at all? Does Kendrick Lamar owe the game? Does Kendrick Lamar owe the timeline a reaction? I would argue no. Kendrick Lamar owes his art. Kendrick Lamar owes his kids, his mother, his partner, his label, his integrity, and his audience, in whatever order he chooses. Kendrick Lamar does not owe another artist's promo cycle. Kendrick Lamar does not owe another camp's marketing calendar. If Kendrick Lamar decides to skip the response entirely and keep building the next monument, that is his prerogative, because silence is not a concession. Silence is a strategic asset, and Kendrick Lamar has weaponized silence more effectively than most rappers have ever weaponized a diss record. And while everybody is staring at the loudest storylines, something else slipped through the cracks that deserves a spotlight, because the game's rollout itself is starting to wobble, and I do not say that casually. When a rollout starts hemorrhaging features, when confirmed guests become conspicuously absent inside a 2-week window, that is a signal no podcast tour can cover. CHIKE walking away is the most visible loss, but the rumblings say he is not the only one. Other West Coast collaborators are reportedly quieting their commitments. Nothing official, nothing announced. But when doors start closing on collaborations, the tracklist that eventually ships is not the tracklist that was on the whiteboard. That is how these projects actually operate. And that is a reality Wack 100 cannot spin his way around, because you cannot talk your way through a shrinking feature list. That is a receipt the whole industry can count with its own eyes. Which is exactly why the timing of Smack's statement matters so much. Smack did not drop that sentence on a random Tuesday. Smack dropped it inside a very specific pressure window, right as the strain on the game's rollout was peaking. The message underneath the message was surgical. We are not engaging your promotional narrative. We are engaged in our own creative narrative, and you will be discussing our narrative whether you want to or not. That is a masterclass in strategic communication. That is Kendrick Lamar's camp signaling, without saying it directly, that the leverage already changed hands. Because that is how power moves in this culture. Power does not shout. Power does not tweet. Power lets a trusted lieutenant say one sentence in one room, and by the next morning the entire industry has adjusted its posture. And since we are keeping every receipt on the table, think about what the last verified response from Kendrick Lamar actually looked like, because the precedent matters here. The last time the entire industry demanded an instant reply from Kendrick Lamar, he vanished for months, let the opposition empty its entire clip into the air, and then reappeared with a sequence of records that turned a rap disagreement into a Super Bowl set list. That is the documented pattern. The delay is not fear. The delay is the product. Every week Kendrick Lamar spins inside that studio while the timeline begs for a reaction. The eventual impact gets heavier, the anticipation compounds like interest, and the opposition spends its loudest ammunition shouting at a man who is not in the room. By the time Kendrick Lamar speaks, the other side has already told on itself 10 different ways, and all that remains is for him to read the transcript back over a beat. That is not speculation. That is the exact film we all watched together. And the idea that this time would unfold any differently requires ignoring every piece of evidence the last 3 years produced. Now here is my honest read, and I already know some of you are warming up in the comments. Kendrick Lamar is not scared of the game. Kendrick Lamar is bored by the framing. Kendrick Lamar has already lived through a conflict cycle at a magnitude the game has never operated at. Kendrick Lamar has headlined the Super Bowl, cleared a decade of chart real estate, broken box office numbers, and stacked enough hardware that his rivals would need to build a second house for storage. Kendrick Lamar is in a different weight class right now. Not skill for skill, because pound for pound the game can rap with almost anybody breathing, but era-wise, footprint-wise, gravity-wise. Kendrick Lamar has been broadcasting on a different frequency for years, and this entire storyline is an attempt to drag him back down to a frequency he already outgrew. History has never once rewarded the artist trying to pull a bigger star into a smaller conversation. And look at what this moment reveals about the coast as a whole, because this is bigger than one album cycle. Kendrick Lamar is the sun that entire ecosystem orbits. Baby Keem, Ray Vaughn, the whole PG Lang constellation, the Compton youth wave, the producers spinning out of Soundwave and DJ Dahi's circles. Every one of those threads runs back to Kendrick Lamar as the anchor. So AZ Chike is not just a rapper choosing a side. AZ Chike is one of the sharpest young pens the coast has, and where AZ Chike plants his flag has downstream consequences for how the next generation of Compton voices reads its own loyalties. When AZ Chike pulls a feature, other young rappers watch. Other young rappers take notes. That is the part the game and Wack 100 keep underestimating. This is a cultural realignment happening in real time, and Kendrick Lamar is not even the loudest voice in the room. He is simply the artist everyone else calibrates against. Every young West Coast rapper alive right now is asking the same quiet question. Which side of history has the longer runway? And if you ask that question honestly, there is only one answer on the board. Also, let me remind everybody of one more thing. Kendrick Lamar does not need to be provoked into motion. If Kendrick Lamar wanted this situation as the centerpiece of a campaign, verses would already be ringing in your ears. But Kendrick Lamar has clearly clocked that the game's rollout is doing its own damage without any assistance. Why would Kendrick Lamar spend a single bar on a situation already losing the news cycle by itself? That would be handing a struggling promo campaign the exact adrenaline shot it needs. Silence is the correct move, and it is also the move that hurts the most, because a silence you are dying to break is the loudest verdict a room can deliver. Now zoom in on Smack himself for a second, because Smack is one of the most respected executive voices in this entire culture. Smack knows exactly what a phrase like he is in the studio triggers. Smack knew every outlet would pick it up. Smack knew Wack 100 would be forced to respond to it. That was not a random press pop-off. That was a targeted microphone drop from an executive who has played this game at the highest altitude for more than 2 decades. And here is what the board actually looks like on the ground. Camp 1. Kendrick Lamar, TD, PG Lang, Smack, Soundwave, DJ Dahi, Baby Keem, and by every available indication, AZ Chike. Camp 2. The game, Wack 100, and a louder coalition of veterans and podcasters who benefit from staying visible. Camp 3. The neutral middle, the artists, journalists, and fans still deciding where to plant their flag. Camp 3 decides how this story gets remembered. And right now Camp 3 is watching Camp 2 contradict itself in real time, while Camp 1 says nothing and gets stronger by the hour. And if we are being completely honest, this is not the first time the game has miscalculated a high-profile attachment. There is a documented history of attaching his name to a bigger star's news cycle. Some of those attachments worked. Others detonated in his hands. This one is trending toward the second column, because when you attach your name to Kendrick Lamar's news cycle without a real angle to justify it, Kendrick Lamar's news cycle simply absorbs you and keeps moving. And speaking of absorption, watch how the algorithm itself is grading this story. Videos carrying Kendrick Lamar's name in the title are spiking. Videos carrying the game's name are spiking considerably less. That gap is audience interest measured in cold numbers by a machine that does not care about anybody's feelings. In this cycle, the game is relevant precisely because his name is welded to Kendrick Lamar's. Remove the Kendrick Lamar half of that equation and the numbers fall through the floor. Now there is one more move I need you watching, because it is quietly the most dangerous card left on the table for the game's side. And that is whatever Baby Keem does next. Baby Keem is Kendrick Lamar's cousin and PG Lang co-founder. Baby Keem does not have to record a diss. Baby Keem can simply appear on a record, and the pairing alone becomes a whole paragraph in the story of this month. Baby Keem moves surgically. Then there is the wild card named Ray Vaughn, whose ferocity every serious rap fan has already registered. If Ray Vaughn sends one subliminal in this window, that subliminal is going to leave a mark, because Ray Vaughn does not miss. Kendrick Lamar does not have to fire a single line personally. Kendrick Lamar commands an entire label full of pens. He is the general, but the army is very much not on vacation. Now let me speak directly to the real fans for a moment. If you genuinely love this culture, you do not actually want this to escalate. You want records, not incidents. You want bars, not bad news. And that makes Kendrick Lamar's silence the most fan-loving move available to him right now, because the second Kendrick Lamar picks up a pen with the game's name in mind, the temperature spikes to a place nobody truly wants to visit. There is an enormous difference between avoiding a fight because you cannot win it and avoiding a fight because winning it costs the culture more than it gives. Kendrick Lamar is doing the second thing, which leaves the game with exactly two exits. Exit 1. Publicly extend the olive branch, walk the energy back toward coastal unity, promote the documentary 3 on the strength of its music, and stop letting Wack 100 author the storyline. Exit 2. Keep escalating. Keep letting the GNX references fly. Keep watching the feature list shrink. Keep dragging Kendrick Lamar into every interview and pray the collision produces a temporary sales bump. Exit 2 ends badly. Exit 2 ends with a Kendrick Lamar record that inverts the entire narrative and absorbs the game into it as a footnote. Exit 1 is the only intelligent move left on the board, and every hour the game does not take it, the doorway on Exit 1 gets a little narrower. Now, if you are still riding with me, here is the honest forecast, screenshot it if you want. First, Kendrick Lamar releases music inside the next quarter, and it will not be a diss. It will be a statement, a body of work reasserting who sits at the top of this culture. Second, the documentary 3 lands with a leaner track list than originally advertised, and a chunk of its cycle gets swallowed by whatever Kendrick Lamar drops. Third, Wack 100 doubles down on the framing for about 2 more weeks, and then quietly pivots. Fourth, DJ Akademiks either makes that Compton trip and it becomes a Farm Messier story, or the trip evaporates without explanation. Fifth, CHIKE'S drops something new, and the timing will not be an accident. Sixth, Baby Keem gets involved. And seventh, every receipt from this month gets archived, ready to be replayed the next time somebody decides to test Kendrick Lamar. So the takeaway is simple. Kendrick Lamar is doing exactly what a top-tier operator does when a smaller operator tries to force a confrontation, refusing the fight on the smaller operator's terms while quietly building the conditions to end it on his own. The only reason the scared framing is still being sold is that the alternative framing does not move albums. And here is the honest read I have to leave you with. There is no version of this story where Kendrick Lamar loses. Even Kendrick Lamar's silence is a victory, because when the biggest artist in your genre refuses to acknowledge the frame you are building, the frame collapses under its own weight. That is not fear. That is gravity. Gravity does not argue. Gravity just keeps pulling everything toward the largest mass in the room. And the largest mass in this culture, whether you love it or hate it, is Kendrick Lamar. Understand, none of this is disrespect toward the game as an artist. This is an audit of a strategy, and the strategy has been fumbled. The bars contradicted each other. The features walked. The commentary boomeranged. And the biggest name on the board responded by locking into a studio and letting his manager announce it to the world. That is not hostility. That is a mic drop delivered in a whisper. And by the time the game fully processes what happened this month, it will already be too late to change course, because the internet gives you exactly one chance to define the story, and if you fumble that chance, the story defines you instead. Zoom all the way out, and this was never really Kendrick Lamar versus the game. This is about who controls the story the culture tells itself about the next decade of hip-hop. Kendrick Lamar has spent a decade authoring that story through albums, performances, mentorships, silences, and a consistency almost nobody else in this era has matched. The game is trying to enter that story late, but the manuscript is already written. When the finished copy drops, the game is going to discover his name is not on the cover. It is somewhere in the middle, in a chapter he did not write. That is what happens when you try to bend a story that is bigger than you. So if you made it all the way to this point, I need 3 things from you. First, hit the comments and tell me straight. Should Kendrick Lamar respond? Or should Kendrick Lamar let the silence keep strangling the narrative? I read every single one. Second, smash that like button and lock in the subscription, because the next chapter of this story is going to rupture the timeline, and I am walking you through every beat of it the second it lands. And third, the part 1 really need you to hear. Do not buy the framing. Kendrick Lamar is not scared. Kendrick Lamar is not hiding. Kendrick Lamar is not dodging. Kendrick Lamar is doing what Kendrick Lamar has always done, converting silence into architecture and studio time into cultural weaponry. And when the release lands, half the timeline will swear they saw it coming while the other half scrambles to delete their old tweets. Fam, keep your eyes on the West, keep your ears on the Whisper Network, and keep those comments coming. And if you want to know what happens the moment Kendrick Lamar finally breaks that silence for real, if you want to know what the games camp does the day a Kendrick Lamar record actually drops, if you want to see how DJ Akademiks survives a Compton visit with half the coast watching, and how Wack 100 responds when CHIKE'S exit officially reshapes that tracklist, then tap the video sitting on your screen right now, because that one connects every thread we just pulled apart. The story only gets louder from here. Kendrick Lamar just rearranged the entire chessboard, and the pieces have not stopped moving.